Pentagon spokesman John Kirby joins me now. Good to have you with us, Mr. Kirby. Thank you very much for joining us. We watched your news conference just a short while ago. So I guess the first question is, what is the purpose of these 8,500 troops that are getting ready here in the U.S.? Should they be called to a NATO force? Where would they be stationed, and what's their purpose?
Well, they are to flesh out the NATO response force. It's a 40,000 force-strong response force. Some of it would be in a very ready task force of about 20,000. So most of these troops would be our contribution, the United States contribution to this NATO readiness force that would be on sort of a high alert inside the alliance. All we're doing today, Martha, is telling these units, you need to get ready, and you need to be ready to go on a shorter, perhaps, timeline than maybe you were before. No deployment orders have been signed today. They're not leaving the United States today or in the imminent future, but we want to make sure that they're ready in case they're asked.
But you said it's still true what the president said a month ago, that they would not deploy to Ukraine.
That's right. These troops, if activated by the alliance, not by the United States, but if the Ready Response Force was activated by the alliance, they would go to NATO allies, mostly on the eastern flank of the alliance, those allies that would want that kind of capability, additional robust defensive capability inside their borders.
But that wouldn't prevent Vladimir Putin from going into Ukraine just because there are troops that are positioned in other countries around there.
Yeah.
And well, especially when he knows and has been told by the White House that no U.S. troops are going to enter Ukraine.
What the President Biden has made clear is that there'll be severe economic consequences if he does make another incursion into Ukraine, and the international community will respond as well. But the purpose of these troops is to bolster and reassure our NATO allies. That's what they would be going to do.
So they would be there to prevent Putin from going further than Ukraine? Into their countries?
We don't know exactly what Mr. Putin has in mind, but this is designed to make sure that we are meeting our commitments to the NATO alliance.
Okay. What about our Ukraine embassy? And, what are the plans? Would the U.S. military be involved in removing people from that embassy?
We don't have any plans to do that right now, Martha. As I think you saw, the State Department actually ordered the departure of some eligible family members from the embassy in Kyiv. I'd let the State Department speak to that process, but there's no military role in that in that ordered departure at this time.
So what I'm hearing is that there's movement of some material, some support for Ukraine, troops that could potentially be in other countries. So I guess what is evident in all of that is that it doesn't necessarily deter Vladimir Putin from entering Ukraine. Then the only thing that he would face would be potential economic sanctions if he goes ahead and does it.
Well, he's also going to face a Ukrainian armed force that is not the same armed force that existed in 2014, and we are continuing to flow security assistance to them, arms and ammunition. In fact, we had just a couple over the course of the weekend, which arrived in Ukraine just from the United States alone, not to mention the kind of security assistance that the Ukrainians are getting from other NATO partners and NATO allies in Europe. So they are a more capable force. Look, I mean, the economic consequences are not to be shrugged off, Martha. They're significant and severe. Some of them are ones we've not chosen to use before, and it would just further isolate Russia from the international community.
So I think some people look at the deterrents that were already out there. For instance, the suggestion that we would move missiles away from the Russian border in those countries. President Biden has said he's open to rearranging some of those missiles that they don't like on their border. Also, the president has assured Russia that Ukraine is not going to become a NATO member anytime soon. So that is also something that Russia wanted. Nord Stream 2 looks like it's going to go forward. So I guess, the question is, why would he, having achieved all of those things, what does he look at in this current scenario that's being described now and say, oh, gee, that's going to keep me on my side of the border?
Boy, I wish I could get inside Putin's head. I'd be able to better answer those questions. But I can tell you that there will be consequences, severe consequences, if he decides to make another incursion into Europe. And by the way, those things we were willing to discuss, Martha, they haven't been decided. They haven't been done. They haven't been changed. In fact, we made it very clear in the Russians very early on that the only way we'll discuss things like scaling back perhaps missile capabilities or scaling back exercises on the continent is if the Russians reciprocated. And they clearly have not done that. Now, that said, you heard Secretary Blinken on Sunday say that there's still a path forward here for diplomacy. We at the Department of Defense absolutely want to see diplomacy succeed here in de-escalating the tensions. We just want to make sure that if it doesn't, and if we are needed to bolster our NATO allies, we're ready to do that.
You know, in terms of, we've watched the progression of increased military capability to Ukraine, and we saw in the last administration it was ramped up from the prior administration. So in terms of what they can they expect, for instance, the Javelin anti-tank missiles? Would they be moved into Ukraine? And if so, how many of them?
Yeah, they will get additional Javelin anti-tank missile systems from the United States. I don't have the exact number here, but we have a $200 million package that the president just approved right before Christmas that we are now fulfilling. I think there's been at least 2, maybe 3 deliveries already just in the last few days. They will include additional Javelin anti-tank missiles. They will include some air defense systems. They will include small arms and ammunition, certainly medical support, that kind of thing. I mean, but there's a lot more coming, and we're going to continue to do that.
All right, before I let you go, the only Americans are the trainers that you talked about that are there right now. Are there discussions to increase the number of special forces or trainers who are in country in Ukraine now?
Not right now, Martha. No, we're not talking about increasing the footprint. And you're right to call them trainers. That's what they're doing. They're advisors. They're assisting the Ukrainian armed forces as they develop better competence and battlefield skills. They're still on the ground right now. We're watching this very, very closely. No plans to add to their number. And clearly, we're going to make sure that their safety and security, as the situation becomes more tense, is of paramount concern to the Secretary and to the Department.
Okay. A lot going on, and we do appreciate your time. John Kirby, thank you for being here. We hope you'll join us again.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.